Want to thank again the Great Yellowstone Coalition and all those who helped put this event together. It's really great to see so many people interested in some of these issues that we have here at Wind River. The two tribes here, both Buffalo people, and you know, I feel very fortunate to be able to work on behalf of the tribes in my capacity with the National Wildlife Federation. I think a lot of this work is really about cultural revitalization, holding on to some of our belief systems, our values that we can pass on to our future generations. We have to consider the historical implications of what colonization brought. We have to question many of the things that are a reality for us today. Our young people aren't going into farming and ranching, nor did our grandmas and grandpas when they were forced into it back in 1887. Agriculture was an imposed system. If agriculture would have been feasible here on this location, our Shoshone and Arapaho people would have been doing it, but they weren't. They were hunters. They were fisher people. They gathered and they moved throughout a large territory for our foods, our medicines, and our water. If we think about what happened to our grandmas and grandpas way back when and what they were forced into, it was to become farmers or ranchers or we would lose our land. And we lost much of our land. Riverton itself was formed because of the General Allotment Act that opened up our reservations for homesteading. That created a checkerboard effect of fee lands, allotted lands, and tribal lands. Makes it very difficult to put those pieces of land back together to think about managing them more holistically. As agriculture and cattle production was promoted on this reservation, then it severed our connection to the water, severed our connection to those places along the river. In the summer times when we used to go and live in the mountains, this type of a lifeway was eradicated or eroded away so that we could live in squares, so that we would be able to adopt the lifeways of the dominant culture, society, become focused more about money. If we think about our people, our grandmas and grandpas a long time ago, that dollar, the money, wasn't as important as the health and wealth of those plants and animals, the clean water. We used to be able to go to our springs, our rivers, and drink right from the river, but there have been diseases that have been brought. Diseases brought by livestock. And we have to question these things. Is this the way it is now? Is that the way it always has to be? And for me, I don't believe it does. I think that it can be better with buffalo. But we have to think about those land use systems that were imposed on us, that took our land and broke it into little squares. That doesn't make sense. The fences themselves are probably the epitome of colonization that removed us from that connection to our land. Today, we have the opportunity to change land use for something that's more beneficial for our future generations. 67% of our reservations divided into 92 grazing units managed by the Department of Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs. The BIA has focused on cattle, priority on 92 grazing units across the reservation, despite the tribe's success in restoring species like pronghorn antelope and bighorn sheep, protecting species like wolves and bears in our own codes and regulations. We had to start on 300 acres when we brought our first buffalo in 2016. We now have about 2,000 acres locked up for Shoshone tribe's buffalo. Rapo tribe started with 600 acres, and we're getting ready to add another 400 acres on the north end and the south end of that. This is a piecemeal approach to get towards something larger. We had to start small so that we could build community support. Make sure our young people know that we're not in this for the dollar. We're not trying to market buffalo. We're not trying to commodify the meat. We want to make that meat available to our tribal members while also working to heal the land, changing our land use priority from that of cattle to that of buffalo. There's a lot of cattle producers on the reservation and around us. This isn't to undermine anyone's livelihoods. It's not to do away with cows. It's just simply stating that there are places where cattle do not belong. And why cannot we also have buffalo? We're an Indian reservation, and we got priority in cattle. We have to question the history of why these things are the way they are. If we retire grazing permits and we look at some of those range units that are in the mountain areas or in the riparian areas, then it's better to restore buffalo in some of those places where they're going to benefit our entire tribal community. So if we look at public lands, cattle producers get a permit very cheaply and benefit from that landscape. But when I go to the reservation and I go up into the mountains and I see a cow, I can't harvest that cow. We do have seasons for our wildlife species though, because those animals are important to our families to be able to feed ourselves. So there's places where buffalo belong, and there's places where cattle belong. But we have to question what it is we want to see on the landscape. Buffalo improve plant and animal biodiversity because of their unique ecological behavior. Cattle, they are a non-native species. They do not have the ecological benefits on the landscape that a buffalo does. You hear the argument about, cattle replacing buffalo on the landscape ecologically. That is false. It's not true. But with buffalo restoration, that landscape, the plants and the animals heal. They will in turn heal us. But we have to create the opportunity for them to exist, because right now buffalo are ecologically extinct. You have to go to parks and refuges and private ranches to see them. They do not exist as wildlife on the landscape like elk and deer and moose and bighorn sheep and pronghorn antelope and mule deer and white-tailed deer, or the wolves and bears. Buffalo are treated like cows more often than not. They're treated as a commodity to make money. We have the opportunity to do something different here, to restore them to large landscapes, to protect them under our own codes and regulations as a wildlife species. This opportunity here at Wind River has the potential to set precedent across the whole nation for what buffalo managed as wildlife on tribal lands actually looks like. So the potential here at Wind River is pretty enormous. A lot of people come and hear about this opportunity, and we've got a lot of supporters. The goal, I think, is to remember that our cultural connection to this animal goes back for millennia. It's been separated from us for about 130 years. But when those kids come out to see the buffalo, and that cultural connection is made, it empowers them. They leave with something special. They leave with a spark that they didn't have when they got there. As we begin to get these animals into our diet, into our lives, into our ceremonies again, then we're going to begin creating a better future for our people, but it's also connected to the land. How we manage the land. We have to do that ourselves. Can't rely on BIA to do it. We can tell BIA what needs to happen. We can rely on our partners like the Fish and Wildlife Service to continue to provide that trust responsibility to us. And we can exercise our sovereignty, actually food sovereignty, and self-determination to get this animal back into our lives and in our diet again. Buffalo, foundational to who we are, both tribes. It's in both of our sun dances. It's in both of our ceremonies. Buffalo can be something that brings us together to strengthen our communities for our future. Our young people, many of them are both tribes. Doesn't make any sense to use buffalo for division. Buffalo is what's supposed to help us heal, bring us together, ensure that we have a better future for our children. So, my reasoning behind all this, and my work is really quite simple. I want to be able to go hunt buffalo with my kids and grandkids. To be able to go out there and field harvest the buffalo in the same way that we take elk, deer, moose, bighorn sheep, pronghorn antelope, whitetail, mule deer. The buffalo should have that same status as those other species, not like cattle. We have to think about that ecological integrity for future generations, not just the dollar and what we can make from selling it. So there's a couple paradigms at work, always at play. Our traditional ecological knowledge and how that drives the future management decisions, and how we relate to our land, or the economic one. We're sitting in a casino. That's economic, to help create opportunities. That's good. But what do we want for our future? And how do we make sure buffalo is right there at the bottom of it? So I want to thank you for the opportunity. I think I've used up my time. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. I think it was more like 20 years, but that's okay. I'm not that bad. I got me a break. Because it is tough to work with Yellowstone bison. It is an intractable issue. And that's really the place to start. And, I recognize some faces in the audience. There's a lot I don't. So I thought I would just, for the sake of 13 minutes, just start at the beginning and kind of talk about where I think we are today, and then maybe talk a little bit about tomorrow. The Yellowstone bison are the last of the wild bison. Period. And at one point there was as few as 24 in the park. We brought in other animals and tried to restore bison in the park. And it was incredibly successful. And as bison relearned their migration routes and relearned how to use the landscape, they began migrating outside of the park. And that created a ton of conflict. The state of Montana sued the federal government for the imminent risk of brucellosis transmission and the impact of that on the state's livestock industry. Bison are infected with brucellosis. It's a disease that, for all the ranchers in here know, can pose trade limitations, restrictions, can have an economic cost. What ensued was decades of court negotiation. It resulted in an interagency bison management plan. This is in 2000. It was signed between the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Interior, and the state of Montana. Really, the bottom line was to, as bison migrated outside of the park, round them up and ship them directly to slaughter. And if winter was particularly severe, so if the whole herd left, we would hold animals for release in spring back into the park so that we would protect a minimum number in the park. And there was a whole bunch of other details, but that's it, black and white. And that's what I came to Yellowstone to implement in 2001. So, and what we're trying to do in Yellowstone is different than how bison and buffalo are managed almost anywhere else, at least on federal lands. You know, why is it worth it? And I think Jason hit a lot of the reasons. There's just an incredible value for having something called a wild buffalo. And that probably means something a little bit different to everybody in this room. To me, it means an animal that responds, and a population that responds more so to nature than to our actions. Our vaccinations, our roundups, our set AUMs, our control on the system. There's incredible value in that. As a Park Service person, and trying to implement the management policies of the park, we are trying to manage wildlife, or I prefer the word conserve and protect wildlife, in ways that enhance the functioning of the ecosystem. By allowing bison numbers to increase, by allowing them to migrate across the park, it has had incredible positive effects on how soils are created, how soil nutrients are maintained, on biodiversity at all sorts of different levels, whether it's at the plant level, at the animal level, at the landscape level. They're teaching me that the world looks different than what cattle ranching and managed bison have taught me to expect it to look like. Bison create these massive grazing lawns. They migrate with the wave of spring across the park. They stop doing so. They modify how the grasses grow. Riparian areas are not tall stands of cottonwood trees and willows. They create a different landscape than what I've been taught is what we should protect. Having a place like Yellowstone to teach us that, and what is the potential in tribal areas and other public lands, it's incredibly important. Genetically, it's the only wild population that has enough animals that you do not need trucks and trailers to maintain the diversity that lives within the herd. That's important. And to stand out there or be in an airplane and see thousands, 6,500 bison maybe this year, probably 6,300, to see that on the landscape, that means something different to everybody in here, but nobody would say that that's not important. Okay, so back to what I do each day, which is the intractable issue of bison. Buffalo. So the Interagency Bison Management Plan was the federal and state government essentially coming together to figure out how we're going to manage animals. Really no partner gave up their authority, but we created this working group to try to come together, to try to find common grounds for what should we do when bison walk outside of the park? How many animals within the park is too many? Over time, I really think that buffalo in Yellowstone is maybe not the best example, but it's an example of how we've tried to enhance our collaborative management with tribes and how we've tried to provide access to bison for tribes. Beginning in the mid-2000s, we brought on 3 tribal entities as partners, as much as the state of Montana. Confederate, Salish, and Kootenai tribes, the Intertribal Buffalo Council, the Lethbridge tribe. Over time, we brought on the Confederated tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Blackfeet Nation, Yakima Nation, Crow, Northern Arapaho, and there's up to 8, so I'm missing 1. And when we come together 3 times a year, we try and solve these intractable problems. And the first one is, how many bison are there in the park right now? What should we do this winter when bison start to exit the park? And how can we provide tribes access to animals that are deemed as surplus, meaning they would be removed from the population? These decisions are not always made by complete consensus, but we really are sitting around at a table like this trying to make progress. we've been very successful at managing for thousands more animals than what we were originally asked to do. Why is that important? Other than the ecosystem benefits, it provides more animals migrating outside of the park, which has allowed thousands of Yellowstone bison to be harvested by tribes on public lands outside the park boundary. It's imperfect, but it's a movement in the correct direction rather than the reverse direction. We've started the Bison Conservation Transfer Program with the Assiniboine and Sioux tribes and others, and that has really been we believe in something that's right, which is returning Yellowstone bison to tribes live. And we sat around, I can't tell you how many tables, trying to figure out how to make that happen. Sometimes we didn't get the answer that we wanted, or one partner didn't, and sometimes we did. Robbie Magnan, who's not here for me, I'll take his 5 minutes. If that's cool. I'll speak for Robbie, unless there's somebody else from the Assiniboine and Sioux, and I won't do that then. But we spent several years trying to figure out, can we create I guess going back to the beginning, we can't ship live bison, or it's been very difficult to ship live bison out of Yellowstone Park to tribes to start new herds. The state of Montana law prohibits the transfer of bison originating from the park unless they're first certified as brucellosis free. So we've developed this program to hold animals in containment 1 to 3 years, certify them as brucellosis free, and move them to the Assiniboine and Sioux tribes, Fort Peck, and then for the Assiniboine and Sioux to move 70 to 80% of those animals to other tribes across the country. Cam referenced that in his earlier talk. Just trying to make that happen. Nothing's easy. It's always easy to find the wrong answer, or why you can't do something. But sometimes you figure out how you can, and those are good days. What else? We try to provide access to Yellowstone bison really in 3 ways. Hunting animals outside of the park, bringing animals into the quarantine program, and then animals that are rounded up and sent to slaughter, they are given to tribes, exclusively to tribes, to support meat and food sovereignty. We're always looking to work with new partners on all of those fronts, because Yellowstone can't control what happens outside of Yellowstone. And the animals don't know that boundary. And we're trying to be the best stewards we can be up until the point that they cross that line. And then find the most meaningful partners, folks at this table and elsewhere, to help us let them cross that line. Sometimes it's live, sometimes it's just to support food sovereignty. And we're in the point where we are initiating a new management plan for Yellowstone bison. It's not going to be like erasing 20 years of collaborative work with tribes and state and federal agencies and starting over. It's more so going to be trying to acknowledge all of the little decisions, all of the adaptive decisions we made along the way, and trying to formalize those into an updated management plan. Trying to enhance our ability to provide access of Yellowstone bison to tribes. Trying to enhance the ability for bison to sustain the Yellowstone ecosystem, and acknowledging that this does create conflict outside the park, and trying to find reasonable ways to manage that conflict. Brucellosis is not, and it's really never been an issue. We know that now. Bison have never transmitted the disease to livestock outside of the park because we've gone to great lengths to prevent that from happening. it's there's ways we can manage animals like wildlife and reduce the implications of these animals having diseases and such. Because going in there and trying to fix that or change that would really change the wild and natural character of what we're trying to protect. So I've been doing this for 20 years in different capacities. I started just following the buffalo around on their migration routes, picking up shit literally to figure out what was in there. And it just didn't make any sense to me when I started seeing animals rounded up at park boundary. And I didn't understand why there are so many people that are willing to go to our corners rather than trying to find common ground to progress this forward. I've learned over the last 20 years that the tribes, as much as anybody, perhaps value these animals more so than anybody I've encountered along the way. And we're trying to find ways to improve our ability to work together. And it takes time, it takes trust, and I'm all for that. And I know the people that I work for are there too. So I guess in one way, I thank you and appreciate your patience as you're trying to figure out this intractable problem. And it's maybe an intractable opportunity. I think we're going in the right direction. We're not going to get there as quick as any of you want us to. But I don't have a closed door. Anybody, reach out to me anytime and tell me what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong. Help us find a better solution. And one of the programs I'm most proud of right now is that through quarantine, we need to learn how to test these animals and move them around the country. And 2/3 of my staff are in an internship program with ITPC, from the Navajo tribe, and the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribe, and 2 others that aren't here yet, so I don't know which tribe it is. But just working together at the ground level goes a long way to building that teamwork and cooperation to really change what we're doing.
Thanks, Blakely. All right, I'm going to try and get this presentation going here for you guys. All right. Well, thank you so much. I am incredibly honored to be here today to speak to all of you guys about Greater Yellowstone Coalition's work to restore bison or buffalo in Greater Yellowstone and beyond. But before I get started, I want to say that all of this work was really done in partnership and collaboration with many of our NGO and tribal partners who are here today, as well as our agency partners, in particular Yellowstone National Park. Without these partnerships and us all working together, none of this would have been possible. So it's hard to overstate the cultural and ecological significance of Yellowstone bison. Not only do these bison descend from the last wild herd, they are considered by most to be the last remaining truly wild herd of plains bison that is ecologically viable, genetically pure, large, and wide-ranging. Yellowstone bison are a reservoir of some of the most important genetics for the long-term conservation of the species, and they are of deep cultural and spiritual significance to the many Native American tribes that have direct ancestral ties to the lands and resources of the Greater Yellowstone. And no doubt, bison conservation in Yellowstone is a conservation success story that deserves celebration. Yellowstone National Park is a long-standing leader in bison conservation and management, from preventing the extinction of the species to providing a source herd for cultural and ecological restoration efforts across North America. However, this story is not without controversy, and still today, these bison are managed under an outdated plan that was meant to significantly limit bison numbers as well as their distribution outside of the park. And still today, this is largely due to unsubstantiated fears around disease transmission risk and to protect the Montana livestock industry. But we believe our most ecologically and culturally important bison herd deserves better. So Greater Yellowstone's work over the last couple of decades is really focused on charting a new course for Yellowstone bison, one where they can truly roam free, where they are allowed to migrate and are managed as a migratory wildlife species with access to lands outside of the park and with habitat needs that extend beyond the park boundary, such as winter habitat and calving grounds, where these bison can restore lost ecosystem processes across the greater Yellowstone landscape, and one where they are no longer managed through mass slaughter and hazing. And then on a broader scale, we want to see wild bison, and ideally Yellowstone bison, used to restore tribal and public ancestral herds across North America. So much of our work over the last couple of decades is really focused on securing habitat for these bison to use outside of Yellowstone by first promoting social tolerance for the species and reducing the potential for conflicts with wild bison on the landscape outside of the park. So this work has included voluntary grazing allotment buyouts and land leases to remove potential conflicts with cattle on the landscape. And some of these are shown here on red in this map. And as a result of this work, there's very few cattle left in these areas just north and west of Yellowstone. In addition, we and our conservation partners started the Yellowstone Bison Coexistence program back in 2011. This is a collaborative effort between GYC, Defenders of Wildlife, NRDC, Sierra Club, and in collaboration with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So this program aims to mitigate potential conflicts for wild bison roaming beyond the park boundaries by offering financial and technical assistance to landowners who would like to build bison exclusion fences on private property to protect private property and prevent damage. This program is still ongoing, and last year we completed our 56th project, and it continues to be a really successful, well-supported program that has really helped to foster social tolerance for wild bison in these communities surrounding the park. So all of this work helped to prime the landscape for the return of wild bison and was critical to the establishment and incremental expansion of bison tolerance areas outside of Yellowstone. So these are areas where bison are now allowed to roam that we and many others have helped to secure over the years. So in the last 20 years, we've really gone from essentially zero tolerance for Yellowstone bison on the landscape outside of the park to now more than 375,000 acres of habitat outside Yellowstone where these wild bison are now allowed to roam. These areas are shown here in the yellow, purple, and pink. The purple represents a year-round tolerance zone, so bison are allowed to be in here year-round now without being hazed back in. And this has basically ended the hazing of bison. More recently, our work has shifted toward restoring bison to these tolerance areas because unfortunately, much of these areas are sitting void of bison. This map here on the left, thanks to the park for both of these, shows the distribution of bison currently, and you can see a lot of these areas are basically sitting empty. However, we know that their prior distribution probably looked something more like this map over here shown by the dotted line. And I would guess too that in recent years on the north side, it's even more constrained to the park, looking at Chris here, due to increases in hunting pressure. But I'll talk about that here in a little bit. So we're working to partner with the Custer Gallatin National Forest on some habitat improvement projects to support bison dispersal throughout these areas, following direction from the new forest plan. We fought really hard to get some new forest plan direction for bison, and we did pretty well. So we got some direction there that's going to support bison year-round use of these areas, as well as broad distribution throughout tolerance areas through habitat improvement projects and other plan direction. But these projects are only going to help if we can first address some of the primary barriers to Yellowstone dispersing farther out, Yellowstone bison dispersing farther out in the landscape, and that is hunting at the park boundary as well as current management actions, namely trapping bison near the boundary for slaughter to meet population objectives under the IBMP. Hunting is a very complex issue. Most bison attempt to leave the park and migrate out of the park through a small bottleneck area in the Gardner Basin just north of Yellowstone. This is a corridor area for many ungulate species coming and going from Yellowstone. And habitat constraints and a patchwork of public lands has resulted in many of the 8 treaty tribes that come to the area to hunt bison every year to congregate on these small patches of land near the boundary right here. And so this, along with the trapping of bison near the boundary for slaughter, has resulted in a barrier that very few bison are getting past. And so Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, along with some of the tribes in the last couple of years, have started to implement some hunting restrictions and hunting closures in some of these areas to try and promote bison dispersal. But overall, there's a lot of disagreement amongst the different treaty tribes that come to this area to hunt about how these bison should be managed and about how to work together to get these bison out on the farther lands, on the larger landscape. And we would really like to see tribal hunting serve as the primary means to manage this bison population, and in conjunction with the transfer program, and to eventually move away from having to use slaughter to stabilize this population. But that's really going to require work to get these bison out on a larger landscape to therefore improve hunting opportunity in the long run. So, as I mentioned, there's also, Chris mentioned the Yellowstone Bison Management Plan and EIS opportunity that's coming up, and I want to come back to that here in a second. But I think equally it's important here is the park looking at making some changes for how these bison are managed, and I will come back to that here in a second. But before that, I want to talk about this other amazing program that Chris touched on as well. So, well, we've made great progress towards securing room for bison to roam outside of Yellowstone, and we're slowly making progress, to restoring these bison to these areas. Many hundreds of bison are still being sent to slaughter every year to try and stabilize the population that is growing exponentially without human intervention, and to meet current population objectives under the IDMP. So over the last several years, we and our conservation and tribal partners, working with federal and state agencies with Yellowstone's leadership, worked to develop the Yellowstone Bison Conservation Transfer Program, and more recently expanded as a way to rehome disease-free Yellowstone bison to tribal lands. And last year, GYC partnered with Yellowstone Park and Yellowstone Forever to raise the funds needed to almost triple the capacity of this facility, which I believe is now near completion. Yeah. This expansion will increase capacity from being able to enter about 80 animals to about 250 animals over 3-year intervals. And it will also reduce the number of bison that are quarantine eligible and that are trapped, that then have to be sent on to slaughter due to capacity limitations at the quarantine facility, from about 70% closer down to 20%. But we don't want to stop there. We want to keep expanding this program by developing 1 or more additional facilities in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, so that 100% of quarantine-eligible bison can be rehomed and diverted from slaughter, and to create a steady pipeline of brucellosis-free bison available for restoration efforts on tribal and ancestral lands across North America. So we're currently working to identify some potential locations, and we're also making some headway on improving the efficiency of this process by pushing the Department of Agriculture and APHIS to update their testing and quarantine timelines so they're consistent with the latest science and data coming out of the park. This could significantly reduce the amount of time it takes for bison to go through this process, especially for bulls. So coming back to Yellowstone's new bison management planning process and EIS, this is such an important opportunity to chart a new course for Yellowstone bison, to really update and shift how they are managed that reflects new information, changed circumstances and regulations, and significant progress has been made since the IDMP was finalized back in 2000. So ultimately, we see this as a timely and much needed opportunity to shift away from the ship to slaughter model of population reduction towards one focused on tribal partnership and cooperation, and the conservation and restoration of our most ecologically and culturally significant wild bison herd namely through rehoming Yellowstone bison and restoring these bison to the larger landscape outside of Yellowstone. So just real quickly, as I mentioned, all this progress has been made in the last 20 plus years. We've got increased tolerance for bison on the landscape outside of the park. Very few cattle conflicts now exist in these areas. The tolerance areas were established. Treaty hunting was initiated in 2006. We know a lot more about disease transmission risk, namely that it's much lower than we once thought, and elk are the primary culprits for transmitting brucellosis to cattle. The transfer program was initiated, and there's a strong desire to use Yellowstone bison to support the ecological and cultural restoration of the species to tribal and public lands across North America. And there's new science out of the park demonstrating that the carrying capacity for the number of bison that Yellowstone can really support is upwards between 8,000 and 10,000 bison. And that is significantly higher than current population objectives, which have ranged between 3,000 and 4,500. So this is an opportunity for Yellowstone to consider management actions and new population target ranges that reflect these changes, and will support bison as a migratory wildlife species, support their dispersal beyond park boundaries. For example, to allow the population to grow and expand towards a carrying capacity estimate, to allow these bison to pioneer into new places in and outside the park where they are currently allowed, that will prioritize tribal hunting opportunities and the transfer program as the primary tools to manage bison numbers, that will support close collaboration and partnership with the tribes to manage these bison numbers together, and together to facilitate bison dispersal and improved hunting effectiveness as a population management tool. And then to allow for the gradual phase out of slaughter as the transfer program is further expanded and as hunting and bison distribution outside the park expands and improves. And then lastly, that will prioritize improved tribal engagement, cooperation, partnership, and fulfillment of treaty rights and access to bison outside of Yellowstone. Now, unfortunately, the state of Montana and current administration is trying to torpedo this process, for lack of a better word. They're asking the park to consider management actions and a population objective that would send us in the wrong direction, that would send us backwards. You know, they would like to see bison numbers reduced and would assume they just stay in the park. And this is really an attempt to undo the last 20 plus years of progress that we've made through collaborative processes, through all of us, NGOs, tribes, federal and state agencies, even the Department of Livestock, coming together to find creative solutions to move this very difficult issue forward. This is yet another attempt by this current administration to insert politics into an issue where it does not belong. So I just want to end by saying that right now, tribes are in an incredible position to influence this process and outcome and play a larger role in Yellowstone bison management going forward. So now more than ever, I hope that we can all work together, conservation groups, tribes, Yellowstone National Park, to ensure this process continues to move forward in a positive direction so that we can get more bison out of the park alive and onto the lands and into the hands of people in the greater Yellowstone and beyond, and really see this thing through to fruition. This is such an exciting time. I'm so excited to be here and really grateful for this opportunity to be here to speak to you all, and I hope that we can have some time over the next day to have some good conversations. Thank you.
You've heard the joke about a buffalo father bringing his son to college. When he dropped him off in front of the college, he told his son, "Bye, son." And his son replied, "Is this where I wallow?" Let me approach this topic from a very different perspective. And let me just throw a couple, 3 one-liners, and I'll come back to them. Number 1 is, in Western science, we could say that if it's not subject to measurement, it's not scientific. In other words, if you can't measure it, it's not scientific. In native science, whether it's Arapaho, Shoshone, Blackfoot, if it's not about relationships, it's not scientific. So, very different approach to the notion of science. When we're talking about in our society, especially during this time of, restrictions during this COVID-19 pandemic era, if I can call it that, everybody's talking about going back to the normal. Well, that notion of that normal really is going back to a world of specialization. Our whole world, especially in the Western world, it's all about specialization. So much so that I identify myself with a specialization. In other words, somebody, Joe Blow on the street, asks me, "Who are you? What do you do?" That's what they always want to know, what they do. I come down this, I tell them, "Oh, I'm a lawyer, I'm a teacher, I'm a plumber," sometimes with pipe dreams. See? But when I come and visit tribal people, just like down here, come to the reservation and so on, the first thing they ask me is, "What tribe are you from?" Once they find out, "Hey, I have some relationships up there, where you come from. I have some friends, do you know so and so?" It's all about relationships, never about what do you do for a living. In other words, what's your specialty? Never about that. So, the thing is, today, the whole notion about this notion of specialty that we're wanting to go back to is fading out. In other words, whole notion about going to school to be a specialist is going down the drain. And young kids are saying, "Why do I have to go to school? Why? I can ask Surrey. I don't need a prof to tell me. I can ask Surrey." Why is that? Well, See, I mentioned it this morning. You know, we as humans, we were saying we have a very short memory to draw on, okay? But we all start out as specialists. I mean, generalists, I should say, not as specialists, but generalists, okay? And that, as generalists, we're jack of all trades. I can climb trees a little bit, nowhere near as good as orangutan. I can swim a little bit, nowhere near as good as a fish can. I can run a little bit, nowhere near as fast as a jaguar can. See, but I can do all of them. But you take that fish and you throw him out on a beach and you throw me into the water, I bet you I'll last longer in the water than that fish would last out on the beach. Why? Because I'm a generalist. Oh, I can do a little bit of everything. I bet you I'll last longer in the water. What does this have to do with buffalo in Yellowstone? A whole lot. It has to do with buffalo because that buffalo, as we were mentioning, as everybody's indicating either directly or indirectly, those animals, as we were mentioning this morning, Jason was mentioning, are generalists. They're eco-engineers, if you can put it that way. They're ecologists, that can balance out things, eco-engineer the environment. And to do that, you have to be a generalist. Let me give you an example from a study by AT&T. There were these business masters of business administration compared to regular arts and science or liberal education students coming out of the gates, so to speak. The MA students in business shot out of the gates, got all the promotions and salary increments and so on, left the lib ed students in the dust. Guess what? After about 6 years, the lib ed students caught up. After about 8 years, the lib ed students were the CEOs. And the MA students were left behind. Why? Because the lib ed students were the generalists. They were the ones that could see everything that was going on within the corporation. Okay? They were the generalists. They could see the whole thing. They knew how to relate things. Okay? Whereas the specialists were stuck in their silos. See the picture? Well, that's what the buffalo is about. When we say keystone species, that's what they're doing, is eco-engineering. They're like that CEO overlooking the totality of the environment. And we as indigenous people, that's what we're learning from. The reason we're still around against all odds has been the fact that we remained generalists and that we did not specialize. So when we're talking about Buffalo Treaty and we're saying we want to bring that buffalo back, we wanted to continue eco-engineering the environment, and in this particular case, Yellowstone, hey, an excellent place to be a showcase as to what this keystone species can do in other areas. They can do it in Yellowstone. Hey, they can do it elsewhere. So all the more important why the buffalo should be allowed the luxury to show us how to eco-engineer, how to bring about ecological balance to the environment so that our land will come back to what it used to be. I have jokingly tell people there was a time when I used to text Neanderthal man, our closest cousin in the humanoid species. Where is he now? He's gone. All he left us was a little bit of his DNA. A little bit of it in every one of us. See? But he's gone. But now, the scientists are already talking about the next species. That is, humanoid species. The species that are going to take over for us. In other words, we're not going to be around very, very long. We're not going to be around very long because we're tending towards this specialization. And we're not, we're straying away from the generalist notions. So if we want to last into the future, we have to remain generalists, learn from our indigenous elders who know all about this notion of being generalists, learn from our keystone species like the buffalo. That's why that bison is very, very important to us. Not just indigenous people, to all of us. Thank you.
Pesselcult Pesia, Jordan Thompson, Pluis West. It's good to be here. All of those degrees seem a little silly now after learning about being generalist. But they're all right. Allow me to be here and get to speak to you all. So happy to be here. I'll pull up my PowerPoint and see if you guys can see that. All right, I'm the last one, so I'm on a tight schedule to get you guys your break before the next panel. So, well, like I said, I'm the Deputy Executive Officer, enjoy not being an attorney anymore, and kind of just really look at special projects and planning for the Salish and Kootenai tribes, which includes a lot of things. And I'm just here to report, in this panel at least, a big celebration we had last week, so I'll end this panel with sort of a happy story. Starts a little gloomy, but I promise you it's going to get better towards the end. So to give you guys some context about where I'm coming from, I come from the Flathead Indian Reservation. You can see on a map, it's up here. This wasn't the best one, but Wyoming's down there. So we were, traditionally we would live seasonally and cyclically, as all indigenous people I'm aware of would. And so we would travel east of the Continental Divide to hunt buffalo in the spring and then in the fall and winter. For hunting trips to go hunt buffalo. So they've always been really important to us, that foundation of who we are as Indian people, spiritually, for sustenance, all of the above. 1855, we signed the Hellgate Treaty, and so we have 3 tribes as part of our reservation. We have the Kootenai, the Kasanka Band of Kootenai, which is the southernmost band of Kootenays, the Pondereer Kalispay, which go all the way down the river, to our cousins, the Kalispels down in Spokane, and then the Salish tribe, which is south of Missoula. And so the treaty was signed and we were promised a 1.2 million acre reservation. We thought actually 2 reservations, that's a story for another day. But a 1.2 million acre reservation that we were supposed to be the Salish and Kootenai tribes in perpetuity for our exclusive use and benefit. And in addition, it was a Stevens Treaty, and so we had off-reservation hunting and fishing use, which means we could go off-reservation to hunt and fish. And in one of our hunting parties on the east side of the divide, when we were going hunting buffalo, one of our tribal folks saw that the buffalo were disappearing. His name was Atatitse. And so after a successful hunting party, he went to the chiefs, and there were orphan buffalo that were kind of following him around, said, hey, can we take these back to the Flat Reservation? I'm afraid that they're not going to be around for much longer. And so the chiefs deliberated for 3 days, and at the end of it came to an impasse. Some chiefs decided, yeah, let's bring them back. Other chiefs said, no, it's important that we come to this place to mingle with other tribes, to respect the land, to be here with our relatives. And so there was no decision made that day. And so Atatitse was a little sad and went home with no buffalo. In the 1870s, his son, Flatati, came back and he found around half a dozen orphaned buffalo. And so he fulfilled his father's vision, and he took them back over the Continental Divide, which, if you guys are familiar with the terrain, was just an amazing feat. I can't even imagine walking it, let alone taking 6 little buffalo with me. And so he started his own little herd of orphaned buffaloes. And he was away one day, and his father-in-law sold his orphaned buffalo to Pablo and Allard. I'm actually an Allard, and that's another story too. Got 9 minutes, I think. So anyway, they bought his herd, and they turned it into an amazing 600 to 900 head of buffalo herd on the Flathead Indian Reservation, free roaming. There were no fences on the reservation at that point in time. And so it was at that point in time the biggest free roaming buffalo herd in the country. And this herd was actually used to stock other herds, including, my understanding, the Yellowstone herd as well. Just so you guys know, in the spirit of Atatitse, that's the untold story of the National Bison Range. If you just Google search that, you can see a 30-minute movie. It's excellent, and we'll give you all the backstory there. And that's just free to watch online. Here's some pictures of the bison on the Flathead Indian Reservation. Then, as with a lot of reservations, we were allotted. And so the United States has this policy of assimilation. And so as part of assimilation, they wanted tribes and tribal folks to be good farmers, understand the value of private property. And so they had the General Allotment Act, or the Dawes Act, which was followed up by specific allotment acts to each reservation. And the Flathead Indian Reservation was hit among the hardest in the country that I'm aware of. And so you can see the map there. The map on the left is the reservation intact, which we originally reserved. The one on the right is after allotment, where the green is still tribal lands. All the white land was opened up to settlers and homesteading. The orange were allotments to each individual tribal member. So each individual got either 80 or 160 acres. They ended up unfortunately losing those because of debt at the mercantile stores or water irrigation fees. You know, cash economy is a totally new system to tribes. And so they did end up losing a lot of their allotments. The purple section there in the middle, that was carved out for the National Bison Range. So after the West was won, the American Bison Society said, hey, we have this national icon, the bison, that we should probably preserve as a monument to America's greatness. But by that point in time, they were almost completely wiped out. Let me back up one sec. So when they did the allotment and created private property, along with private property came fences. And so free roaming bison aren't congruent with fences. And so they made Pablo sell off his herd. And so they went to Canada, they went to other private ranches around the country. And so it was quite an ordeal that took several years to round those bison up and then ship them off. So after they're shipped off, you know, the Flathead Indian Reservation is now without any bison. The American Bison Society, which is relatively affluent folks, non-Indian folks in New York City, thought that, hey, we should start an American bison range, and we should put it on the Flathead Indian Reservation, because one of the members there had lived on the reservation when there were free-roaming buffalo there, and said, that was beautiful, we should have it there. And so Congress passed an act that carved out that piece, 18,000 acres in the middle of the Flathead Indian Reservation, to be the National Bison Range. The ironic thing is, in order to stock the National Bison Range, they had to buy a lot of the buffalo that they had just sold off several years prior to stock the bison there on the range. And then they built a fence around that. And the fence was not only to keep the buffalo in, but the native folks out, as a lot of native elders have said. So it was pretty sad state of affairs on the Flathead Indian Reservation at this time. Tribes were really powerless. The BIA ran everything. Homesteaders overran us on our own reservation. We were outnumbered immensely on our own reservation. And then in 1933, Big Medicine was born on the Bison Range. And I'm sure you guys have probably heard about Big Medicine, but this was a powerful moment in our tribe's history, in our story, because as you know, when you see a white animal, and buffalo especially, you know, that's a sign of great power and great importance. And it was sort of uplifting, saying, hey, you know, the bison are still here, and so are we. And so it just was a really spiritual sign to us that, you know, we were going to keep going on. I want to talk a little bit about federal laws that supported us as tribes, and federal laws and partnerships are critical in, I think, us living on as tribal nations. And so the first one was the Indian Reorganization Act. That was in 1934, which allowed us to organize in a way that the federal government could understand, could recognize. The second one was the Indian Self-Determination Act of the 1975. I'm going to skip termination. But this one was really important because it allowed us to do a lot of the functions that the BIA would traditionally do on the reservation. So we started taking over police department, education department, legal department. We have a lot of departments now. And then the Tribal Self-Governance Act was one in 1934 that allowed tribes to contract non-BIA interior programs like the Bison Range, we thought. So we had a tribal chairman that was visionary, and so he said, hey, these bison came from stocks that we saved. It's on our land. We have a connection unlike no other with these buffalo. We should manage the Bison Range. So we went for it. It took the tribes 10 years to come up with a cooperative agreement with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to try, and that quickly fell apart. Another story from their day, but there's an incredible amount of racism on the Flathead Indian Reservation like elsewhere. You get a lot of border towns, like there are border towns on our reservation because of the allotment and checkerboarding. And so you just have a lot of folks really opposing everything the tribes are trying to do. So if you can kind of read through that list. The first agreement fell apart. U.S. Fish Wildlife employees complained. The second later proved to be false. The second one, private citizens sued saying, hey, tribes shouldn't be taking control of the range. So a judge rescinded the cooperative agreement because of NEPA and said that they didn't have enough explanation as to why tribes should. And then we were going to get ready to go into our third agreement to cooperatively agree. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was kind of dragging its feet, but then something came out of nowhere, which I think kind of dropped our jaws, was they asked us, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service asked us, had we ever considered just taking over the bison range, having it given back to us through a congressional act? We said no, but I mean, that would be a great idea. We would support that. And then so finally, after more than a century of federal management and nearly 2 decades of negotiations, we were able to get transfer of the National Bison Range back through the Montana Water Rights Protection Act of 2020. This was our huge water compact that was passed as part of the COVID relief package at the end of Trump's term, amazingly, and that included the restoration of the bison range. And so this was last weekend. We finally had our big celebration just last weekend. Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland came out. I gotta tell you, it was such a good day. Like, we had a 3-day celebration. That picture up on the top, right, your guys' left, that's Secretary Haaland and some of her staff and a bunch of happy tribal members there. On the next picture over, we had a big powwow, Kainai, drummers, dancers, just everyone got together. And then I, unfortunately, am a terrible photographer because you could see the seats in front, but we had a whole auditorium full of people up in the stands too. And that's where we had our community event, community feast to just really celebrate. It was just an amazing day, and just when I drive by the bison range now, just get filled with a whole new sense of pride. You know, we know they're our relatives, but now that we get to manage and take care of them, I say manage, but I really mean just kind of take care and honor that relationship again. It's just an amazing feeling in my heart and all of our hearts, and just the level of happiness and just fulfillment we all felt last week was just truly remarkable. So I think this is the bison range and beyond. I understand there's a lot of issues with bison around Montana, being the Montana state lobbies for the tribes. And Yellowstone, just appreciate all the work you guys do, but we're just so happy that we have our bison back, and we're going to continue to do whatever we can to try to facilitate you guys getting your bison back into your landscapes too. So with that, I think my time is probably out. Here's my contact if you guys want to ever talk to me any more about this. So, lamb lunch.